The notification chimed on my phone at 11:47 p.m. Another ride request in downtown Seattle, just as I was considering calling it a night. 5 years of driving for Lyft had taught me that late-night pickups could go either way, drunk college kids or weary professionals heading home. I accepted the ride and pulled up to the upscale hotel where my passenger waited. She emerged from the lobby like a ghost from another era. Mid-60s, impeccably dressed in a navy coat that had seen better decades, clutching a vintage leather purse. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, but her eyes held a weight that made me straighten in my seat. She moved with the careful grace of someone carrying invisible burdens. "Good evening," she said, settling into the back seat. Her voice carried a slight tremor, not from age but from something deeper. "Thank you for the ride this late." I glanced in the rearview mirror as she provided the address, a residential area about 20 minutes away. That's when she said it, those words that would haunt me for months. "You remind me of the man I lost." The statement hung in the air between us like smoke. I'd heard confessions before. Passengers often treated rides like mobile therapy sessions, but something about her tone made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. She wasn't making small talk. This was something else entirely, something that demanded attention. If you're enjoying this story of unexpected connections, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss where this mysterious encounter leads us next. I pulled away from the curb, stealing glances at her in the mirror. She sat perfectly still, hands folded over her purse, staring out the window at the city lights. The resemblance she mentioned gnawed at me, not because I understood it, but because of the pain in her voice when she'd spoken those words. "I'm sorry for your loss," I finally said, breaking the silence that had stretched between us. It felt inadequate, but what else could I offer a stranger carrying such obvious grief? She turned slightly, and I caught her studying my profile in the reflection of the passenger window. 43 years, she whispered, more to herself than to me. 43 years since I last saw him alive. Her voice carried the kind of precision that comes from counting days, months, years, the mathematics of loss that grieving people know by heart. You have his jawline, the way he held his shoulders when he drove. The comparison unsettled me in ways I couldn't articulate. I'd been told I resembled my father, my grandfather, even a few celebrities over the years. But this felt different, more personal, as if she were seeing someone specific rather than noting general similarities. The traffic light ahead turned red, giving me a moment to really look at her. Her eyes were fixed on the back of my head now, and I could feel the intensity of her gaze. Whatever memory I was triggering, it was powerful enough to make her hands shake slightly as she clutched her purse tighter. "What was his name?" I asked gently, surprising myself with the question. Usually I maintained professional distance, but something about her vulnerability demanded human connection. The light turned green and I eased forward, taking the longer route to give her time to answer. "David," she said, and the name seemed to cost her something. "David Mitchell. He would have been your age now, maybe a few years older." She paused, her breath fogging the window slightly. "He had your voice too, that same careful way of speaking to strangers." The coincidence sent a chill down my spine. My middle name was David, though I'd never used it professionally. I'd always been just Mike to my passengers, keeping things simple and anonymous. But hearing her say that name, with such reverence and pain, made me feel like I was intruding on sacred ground. "He was a good driver," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "Always checking his mirrors, always considerate, just like you're being now, taking the scenic route so I can talk." She'd noticed. Of course she had. Grief sharpens perception, makes people aware of kindness in ways that ordinary circumstances don't. I found myself genuinely curious about David Mitchell, this ghost who apparently shared my features and mannerisms. But more than that, I was drawn to understand what had happened to him. What loss had carved such deep lines around this woman's eyes? The city blurred past us as we drove deeper into the residential neighborhoods, each mile taking us further from the bright lights and closer to whatever truth she was carrying. "Can I ask what happened to him?" The words left my mouth before I could stop them. In 5 years of driving, I'd learned when to listen and when to stay silent. But tonight felt different. Tonight, professional boundaries seemed less important than human connection. She was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. We passed under streetlights that cast moving shadows across her face, making her appear even more ethereal. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. He disappeared. November 15th, 1979, just vanished. The date hit me like a physical blow. November 15th, 1979, exactly 2 months before I was born. The timing felt too coincidental, too precise to ignore. I tried to focus on driving, but my mind was racing with implications I didn't want to consider. The police said he probably ran away, she continued, bitterness creeping into her tone. Said young men do that sometimes, especially when there are complications. The way she said complications suggested layers of meaning I wasn't privy to, but David wouldn't have left without saying goodbye, not to me. I realized I'd been holding my breath. The resemblance she'd noticed, the timing of David's disappearance, the way she spoke about him with such intimate knowledge. Pieces of a puzzle were forming, but I wasn't sure I wanted to see the complete picture. Were you close? I asked, though something in my gut already knew the answer. Her laugh was soft and sad, the sound of someone remembering better times while drowning in current sorrow. I was pregnant with his child, she said simply, and the world seemed to tilt sideways. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as the implications crashed over me like a wave. 3 months along when he disappeared. The baby would have been born in February 1980, February 12th, 1980. My birthday. The coincidence was no longer something I could dismiss or rationalize away. My adoptive parents had always been honest about my adoption, but they'd known few details about my biological parents. Just that my birth mother was young, unmarried, and had made the difficult decision to give me up. What was your name? I asked, my voice hoarse with an emotion I couldn't identify. Back then, I mean. Your maiden name. I already knew what she was going to say. Felt it in my bones, the way you feel an earthquake before the ground starts shaking. Eleanor Hartley, she whispered. I became Eleanor Morrison when I married James 5 years later. But back then I was just Ellie Hartley, 19 years old and completely alone. She leaned forward slightly, studying my reflection more intently. What's your full name, dear? The question hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. Michael David Thompson, the surname given to me by my adoptive parents, but that middle name, the one I'd never questioned, suddenly felt like a message from a past I'd never known existed. Michael, I managed to say. Michael David Thompson. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the weight of recognition and the terror of truth. Eleanor's sharp intake of breath filled the car. In the rearview mirror, I watched her press a trembling hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and disbelief. David, she whispered. I named you David, Michael David, because I wanted you to carry his name, even if I couldn't keep you. I had to pull over. My hands were shaking too badly to drive safely, and the weight of this revelation was crushing down on me like a physical force. I found a quiet side street and parked under a streetlight, my heart hammering against my ribs. You think you're my birth mother? February 12th, 1980, she said, her voice gaining certainty. Swedish Medical Center. I held you for exactly 17 minutes before they took you to your new family. The specificity of her memory, the pain in her voice, the way she remembered counting those minutes, it all felt too real, too precise to be coincidence. I turned in my seat to face her directly for the first time since she'd gotten in the car. Up close, I could see features that might have been familiar if I'd known to look for them. The shape of my nose, the set of my ears, the way my eyebrows arched. I've looked for you, I admitted. Not recently, but when I turned 18, I tried to find information about my birth parents. The records were sealed, she said, nodding. I made sure of that. I thought it would be easier for everyone if there were no loose ends. No way for the past to complicate your future. Tears were streaming down her face now, years of suppressed grief finally finding release. Tell me about him, I said, my voice barely steady. Tell me about David Mitchell. If this woman was truly my birth mother, then the man I resembled wasn't just some stranger. He was my father, the ghost whose features I'd unknowingly inherited. Eleanor wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse, composing herself with the practiced grace of someone who'd learned to carry grief publicly. He was 22, worked at Boeing as a junior engineer, brilliant mind, gentle heart. We met at a coffee shop near the university where I was studying literature. She painted a picture of young love, of two people planning a future that would never come to pass. David had been excited about the pregnancy, had started looking at apartments they could afford, talking about marriage and the life they'd build together. He was going to propose on Thanksgiving, she said. He'd saved up for a ring, had it all planned out. But he'd disappeared 2 weeks before, I said, following the timeline she'd laid out. The tragedy of it was overwhelming. Not just that I'd lost a father I'd never known, but that she'd lost the love of her life just when their future seemed brightest. The last time I saw him, he was agitated about something. Eleanor continued, said there were things at work that didn't make sense. People asking questions about projects he wasn't supposed to know about. Boeing was working on classified contracts then, Defense Department stuff. Her voice dropped lower, as if even now, decades later, she was afraid of being overheard. The implication hung between us, that David Mitchell's disappearance might not have been voluntary, might have been connected to something larger and more dangerous than a young man getting cold feet about impending fatherhood. I went to the police, Eleanor said, her voice hardening with old anger. Told them about his concerns at work, about how unlike him it was to just vanish. But they weren't interested in conspiracy theories from a pregnant teenager. They said he'd probably gotten scared and run off. The dismissive attitude of the authorities clearly still stung 43 years later. I could imagine her, 19 and pregnant, trying to convince skeptical detectives that her boyfriend's disappearance was more than just another case of a young man avoiding responsibility. Did you ever find out what he was working on? I tried, she said. After you were born, after I'd recovered, I went to Boeing. They said David Mitchell had never been employed there. The words dropped like stones into still water, creating ripples of implication. No record of him, no personnel file, nothing, like he'd never existed. The chill that ran down my spine had nothing to do with the Seattle weather. Companies didn't just erase employees from their records unless something serious had happened. What did you do then? What could I do? I was 20 years old, alone, with no money for private investigators or lawyers. I had to focus on surviving, on making a life for myself. She looked out the window at the quiet residential street where we'd parked. I married James when you were 5. He was a good man, patient with my grief, understanding about the parts of my past I couldn't talk about. Couldn't or wouldn't? I asked gently. There was a difference, and something in her tone suggested she'd been carrying secrets all these years, not just sadness. Her silence stretched long enough to become an answer in itself. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Some stones are better left unturned, Michael. Some truths are too dangerous to pursue. Dangerous how? I pressed, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. The rational part of my mind was still trying to process the fact that I might be sitting 3 feet away from my birth mother. The rest of me was getting caught up in the mystery of David Mitchell's disappearance. Eleanor's hands twisted the strap of her purse, a nervous gesture that spoke of decades-old anxiety. 3 weeks after David disappeared, I was approached by 2 men in suits. They said they were from the government, showed me badges I didn't know how to verify. They asked me questions about David, about what he might have told me about his work. The story was taking on the dimensions of a thriller, but the fear in her eyes was too real to dismiss. What kind of questions? Technical things I didn't understand. Names of people, project codes, whether he'd ever brought work home or mentioned specific dates or locations. She paused, remembering. They were very polite, very professional, but there was something underneath their courtesy that frightened me. When I told them I didn't know anything, they seemed relieved. I tried to imagine her at 19, pregnant and grieving, being interrogated by federal agents about a boyfriend who'd vanished without explanation. The powerlessness she must have felt was staggering. Did they ever contact you again? Once more, after you were born? They wanted to make sure I understood the importance of not discussing David or his work with anyone. They suggested that continuing to ask questions about his disappearance might not be wise. The euphemism carried weight, the kind of veiled threat that stays with someone for decades. And you never tried to find out more? I asked, though I already understood why she hadn't. With a newborn child and no support system, Discretion had probably been the better part of valor. I learned to live with not knowing, Eleanor said, but her voice suggested the learning had been painful and incomplete. James knew about David, knew about you, but we never talked about the circumstances of his disappearance. It was easier to let people assume he'd simply abandoned us. The sacrifice implicit in that statement hit me hard. She'd let people think poorly of David, and by extension of her judgment, rather than risk drawing attention to whatever had really happened. That must have been incredibly difficult. Every day, she admitted, especially when you were growing up somewhere in this city, and I'd find myself looking for you in crowds, wondering if every dark-haired boy I saw might be my son. The longing in her voice was heartbreaking, the grief of a mother who'd given up her child and then spent decades wondering about his life. I had a good childhood, I found myself saying, wanting to ease some of her pain. The Thompsons were kind people. They told me I was adopted from the beginning, never made me feel like it was shameful or secret. It was true. My adoptive parents had been loving and supportive, but there had always been a David-shaped hole in my understanding of myself. I'm glad, she said, and I could see she meant it. I used to drive past the address the adoption agency gave me, just to see the house where you were growing up. I never stopped, never tried to make contact, but I needed to know you were safe. The image of her driving past my childhood home, close enough to see but too far away to touch, was almost unbearable. Why tonight? I asked. Why tell me all this now after all these years? Her smile was sad but determined. Because I'm dying, Michael, and there are some truths that shouldn't die with me. The word dying hit me like a physical blow. I'd just found my birth mother, just begun to understand the mystery of my origins, and now she was telling me our time was limited. How long? I managed to ask, though the question felt inadequate and invasive at the same time. 6 months, maybe less. Pancreatic cancer. She said it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd already processed their own mortality. I've known for 3 months now. That's when I decided I needed to find you, to tell you the truth about your father before it was too late. How did you find me? The logistics suddenly seemed important, a way to focus on concrete details rather than the emotional avalanche threatening to bury me. It took some detective work, she said, a hint of pride creeping into her voice. I knew you'd been adopted by the Thompsons, and I'd kept track of the family over the years. When I learned you were driving for Lyft, I started requesting rides in areas where you might be working. The dedication implied by that strategy was staggering. How many rides had she taken? How many nights had she spent hoping to randomly encounter me? Tonight was the 7th time I'd requested a ride, she continued. I was starting to think it was hopeless, that Seattle was too big and the odds too small. Then your car pulled up, and I saw your face in the rearview mirror. She trailed off, lost in the moment of recognition. The randomness of it all was overwhelming. If I'd decided to go home an hour earlier, if she'd given up after 6 attempts, if any of a dozen small decisions had gone differently, we never would have found each other. What happens now? I asked, though I wasn't sure I was ready for the answer. That depends on you, Eleanor said carefully. I can tell you everything I remember about David, share the few photos and letters I kept, help you understand where you came from, or we can part ways tonight, and you can go back to your life without the burden of these questions. But I already knew there was no going back. The questions were already burrowing into my mind, demanding answers. The men who approached you, do you remember their names, their agency? I kept their business cards for years before I finally threw them away, but I remember the names. Agent Morrison and Agent Hayes, FBI. The irony wasn't lost on either of us, that she'd eventually taken the surname of one of the men who'd warned her to stay silent. Different Morrison, obviously, she added with a weak smile. James thought it was funny when I told him, said maybe it was fate's way of helping me hide in plain sight, but the smile faded quickly. Michael, if you decide to look into this, you need to understand that you might not like what you find, and there might still be people who prefer these secrets stay buried. The warning should have deterred me, but instead, it only strengthened my resolve. I'd spent 42 years not knowing who my father was, accepting that some questions would never have answers. Now, faced with the possibility of truth, however dangerous, I couldn't turn away. I need to know, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. I need to know what happened to him, what kind of man he was, why someone wanted him to disappear. The words felt like a commitment, a line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Eleanor nodded, as if she'd expected this response. Then there's something else I need to tell you, something I've never told anyone. The night before David disappeared, he gave me something to keep safe. What kind of something? I asked, though the way Eleanor clutched her purse suggested I might already be looking at it. The vintage leather bag she'd been holding so protectively suddenly seemed less like a fashion accessory and more like a treasure chest. Documents, she said quietly. Technical drawings, memos, correspondence. David said if anything happened to him, I should keep them safe, but never look at them unless it became absolutely necessary. Her fingers traced the worn leather of her purse. I've carried them with me for 43 years, moved them from apartment to apartment, house to house, never once opening the envelope. The weight of that revelation settled over me. For more than 4 decades, she'd been the guardian of secrets she'd never examined, carrying her disappeared lover's final trust, without knowing what burden she bore. But now you think it's necessary? I'm dying, and you're here, and maybe it's time these secrets found their way to someone who can do something with them. She opened her purse with careful, reverent movements, as if she were handling a religious artifact. I've always wondered if these papers contained the reason David disappeared, the answer to what really happened to him. My heart was racing as she withdrew a manila envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with tape that had long since lost its adhesive properties. My father's handwriting was visible on the outside. For Eleanor, open only if I don't come back. DM. The prophetic nature of that message sent chills down my spine. David Mitchell had known he was in danger, had prepared for the possibility that he might not survive whatever situation he'd found himself in. Have you ever been tempted to look? Every day for the first 5 years, Eleanor admitted. But then I met James, started building a new life, and it became easier to let sleeping dogs lie. These papers became less about finding answers and more about keeping a promise to a man I'd loved. She held the envelope out to me. But promises to the dead shouldn't bind the living forever. Margaret's words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. I pulled over to the curb, my hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. The weight of what she'd revealed pressed down on us both. This woman had spent 37 years believing her husband was dead, only to discover he'd chosen to disappear. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and Margaret's quiet breathing. I could see her reflection in the rearview mirror, her face a mask of controlled devastation. She wasn't crying anymore, but something deeper had settled in her eyes, a kind of hollow recognition that her entire adult life had been built on a lie. Mrs. Chen, I said softly, turning to face her. I can't imagine what you're feeling right now, but maybe there's more to this story than what your son found. Even as I said it, I wondered if I was offering false hope or genuine possibility. She looked up at me with eyes that seemed decades older than when she'd first gotten into my car. You know what the worst part is? She whispered. It's not that he left. It's that he let me grieve him. He let me wear black for a year. He let me visit an empty grave every anniversary of his supposed death. The cruelty of it was staggering. I thought about my own father, about the pain of his actual death, and tried to imagine discovering it had all been an elaborate deception. The betrayal would be almost worse than the loss itself. Margaret reached into her purse with shaking hands and pulled out a manila envelope. David found these, she said, her voice barely audible. Bank records, a new social security number, even a driver's license photo from 1992. She handed me a photocopy of a California license. And there he was, the man from her wedding photo, older but unmistakably alive. The address listed was in San Diego. According to the date, this license had been issued just 3 years after his supposed death in that factory explosion. While Margaret was still placing flowers on an empty grave, Thomas Chen was starting a new life on the other side of the country. There's more, she continued, pulling out additional papers. David hired a private investigator. Thomas remarried in 1995, had 2 children, owned a small restaurant until he retired in 2018. Each revelation was delivered in the same flat, emotionless tone, as if she was reading someone else's grocery list. I studied the documents, trying to process the magnitude of this deception. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was an elaborate, carefully planned disappearance. Someone had helped him fake his death. Someone had provided him with new identity documents. This level of deception required resources and connections. Did the investigator find out why he did it? I asked, though I wasn't sure Margaret was ready for that answer. She was already carrying the weight of knowing he'd abandoned her and their son. Understanding his motivations might be more than she could bear right now. Margaret's laugh was bitter and hollow. Oh, he found out why, all right. Turns out my devoted husband had been living a double life for years before he died. She pulled out another photograph, this one showing Thomas with a young blonde woman and a small child. The timestamp read 1985, 2 years before his disappearance. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Thomas hadn't just decided to leave one day. He'd been planning his escape for years, building a second family while maintaining the facade of his first. The factory explosion had simply provided the perfect opportunity to make his disappearance permanent. Her name was Linda Morrison, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with anger. They'd been together since 1983. Their first child was born in 1984, while Thomas was still coming home to me and David every night, playing the role of loving husband and father. I felt sick to my stomach. This wasn't just abandonment. It was a systematic betrayal that had lasted for years. Every family dinner, every anniversary celebration, every moment of intimacy between Margaret and Thomas had been built on lies. He'd been dividing his time, his affection, his very identity between two families. The investigator thinks Thomas saw the explosion as his chance for a clean break. He could disappear, collect on his life insurance policy through some fraudulent scheme, and start fresh with Linda and their children. No messy divorce, no custody battles, no financial obligations to his first family. The full scope of Thomas's deception was staggering. Margaret explained how the investigator had uncovered a complex insurance fraud scheme that had netted Thomas nearly $200,000 in 1987, money that should have gone to her and David as his beneficiaries, but had somehow been diverted to offshore accounts he'd set up years earlier. He had help, Margaret said, her voice growing cold with fury. His supervisor at the factory, a man named Robert Walsh, was in on it. They falsified the victim identification records, claimed Thomas's body had been too badly burned to recover. Walsh took early retirement 6 months later and moved to Florida. The conspiracy ran deeper than I'd imagined. This wasn't the desperate act of a man trying to escape his problems. It was a calculated heist that had stolen not just money, but Margaret's entire future. The life insurance payout would have helped her and David rebuild their lives, maybe even put David through college without the financial struggles they'd endured. Instead, Margaret had spent years working double shifts as a nurse, sacrificing her own health and happiness to provide for her son. Meanwhile, Thomas was using their stolen money to establish his new life in California, playing father to children who didn't know he'd abandoned his first family. David wants to press charges, Margaret said quietly. Insurance fraud, identity theft, maybe even bigamy since Thomas remarried without legally divorcing me. The statute of limitations hasn't run out on some of these crimes. She looked out the window at the passing city lights, her reflection ghostly in the glass. Margaret pulled out her phone and showed me a text message from David. The words were raw, with decades of suppressed pain and newfound rage. "Mum, he stole our lives. While we were struggling to pay rent, he was playing house with another family using our money. I want him to pay for what he did to us." I could understand David's fury. He'd grown up believing his father was a hero who died in a tragic accident, only to discover he was actually a criminal who'd abandoned his family for personal gain. The psychological damage of that revelation would be enormous. Every childhood memory tainted, every moment of grief revealed as manipulation. "David barely speaks to me now," Margaret admitted. "He's so angry, and I think part of that anger is directed at me for being weak enough to be fooled, as if I should have somehow known that the man I loved and trusted was capable of such elaborate deception." The secondary trauma was almost as devastating as the original betrayal. Not only had Margaret lost her husband twice, once to supposed death, now to the revelation of his true nature, but she was also losing her relationship with her son. David's anger was understandable but misdirected, and it was tearing apart what remained of their family. "He wants me to go to California with him," Margaret continued. "He wants to confront Thomas face to face, demand answers, maybe even expose him to his second family. Part of me wants that too, wants to see the look on his face when he realizes his carefully constructed lies have finally caught up with him." But Margaret's desire for confrontation was complicated by something unexpected: sympathy for Thomas's second family. "His other children are innocent in all this," she said, her voice heavy with conflict. "They're adults now, with families of their own. They've never known their father as anything other than Thomas Morrison, a hard-working restaurant owner who provided for them." The moral complexity of the situation was staggering. Exposing Thomas would bring justice for Margaret and David, but it would also destroy the lives of people who had done nothing wrong. His second wife, Linda, had lived as a widow since Thomas died of natural causes in 2019. She'd already grieved for him once, genuinely this time. "The investigator showed me Linda's obituary for Thomas," Margaret continued. "She wrote about their 34-year marriage, about what a devoted father he was to their children, about how he'd overcome a difficult past to build a beautiful life with them. Reading it felt like looking into an alternate universe where Thomas was actually the man I thought I'd married. I found myself wondering if people could truly change, if Thomas had learned from his betrayal of his first family and become a better man to his second. Did that matter? Could decades of genuine love and fatherhood somehow balance the scales against the devastating harm he'd caused Margaret and David? "David says it doesn't matter if Thomas became a saint in his second life," Margaret said, reading my thoughts. "He says Thomas stole our chance at happiness and used it to build his own. He's not wrong, but I keep thinking about those innocent grandchildren I'll never know and how our quest for justice might destroy their memories of their grandfather." Margaret's phone buzzed with another message from David. This one was more urgent. "Mom, I booked us flights to San Diego for next week. It's time to face him, or at least face his grave and the family he chose over us. We deserve answers even if we have to get them from the people he left behind." The weight of decision pressed down on Margaret like a physical force. I could see her struggling with the choice between seeking justice and protecting innocence, between honoring her son's need for closure and her own complicated feelings about revenge. This wasn't just about confronting Thomas anymore. It was about deciding what kind of person she wanted to be in the aftermath of betrayal. "I've been thinking about something you said earlier," she told me, "about how people can remind us of those we've lost, but also of who we used to be. Looking at you, I remember the woman I was before all this happened, someone who believed in forgiveness, who tried to see the good in people even when they hurt her." Her words carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of moral struggles. Margaret had spent 37 years as a widow, defining herself through loss and perseverance. Now she had to decide whether to embrace anger and revenge, or find some other path forward that honored both her pain and her principles. "But I also remember that woman was naive," she continued. "She trusted too easily, forgave too quickly, and look where it got her. Maybe David is right. Maybe some betrayals are too deep to forgive, too calculated to excuse. Maybe the woman I used to be was weak, and the woman I need to become is harder." As we sat in the growing darkness, Margaret seemed to be having an internal battle that had been brewing for months. "You know what haunts me most?" she asked. "It's not just that Thomas left us. It's that he was apparently capable of being a good husband and father, just not to us. What was so wrong with David and me that he couldn't love us the way he loved them?" The question hung in the air like a wound that wouldn't heal. I recognized the self-blame that often accompanies betrayal, the victim's desperate search for some explanation that makes sense of senseless cruelty. Margaret was torturing herself with the idea that she'd somehow been inadequate, that Thomas's abandonment reflected some failing on her part. "Mrs. Chen," I said gently, "there was nothing wrong with you or David. Thomas's choices were about his own character, not about your worth as a wife or mother. Some people are capable of compartmentalizing their lives in ways that seem impossible to the rest of us." She nodded, but I could see the doubt still lingering in her eyes. 37 years of believing herself a widow had been easier in some ways, than accepting that she'd been deliberately discarded. Death was random and meaningless. Abandonment felt personal and damning. "David thinks I'm weak for even considering forgiveness," she said. "He says Thomas doesn't deserve it, and maybe he's right. But I'm not sure forgiveness is about what Thomas deserves. Maybe it's about what I need to let go of in order to have any peace in whatever years I have left." If you're struggling with your own questions about forgiveness and moving forward from betrayal, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes sharing our stories helps us find the clarity we're searching for. Margaret stared at her phone, David's message still glowing on the screen. The flights were booked, the confrontation planned, but she still hadn't committed to going. "I keep imagining what it would be like," she said quietly, standing at his real grave, knowing he actually mourned this time, meeting the children he chose to raise, seeing the life he built with our stolen money and stolen years. The fantasy of confrontation was seductive but potentially hollow. What could Thomas's second family tell her that would heal the wound of his abandonment? What answers could they provide about choices they'd never known he'd made? Margaret was seeking closure, but she might only find more questions and deeper pain. "David thinks seeing them will give us power over the situation," she continued, "that exposing Thomas's lies will somehow restore what we lost. But I'm not sure destruction brings restoration. I'm not sure revenge brings peace." Her voice carried the wisdom of someone who'd spent decades learning the difference between justice and vengeance. I thought about my own father's death, about how I'd initially wanted someone to blame for his heart attack, his doctors, his lifestyle choices, even himself. But anger hadn't brought him back or eased my grief. Only acceptance and the choice to honor his memory had given me any peace. "Maybe the real question isn't whether to confront Thomas's other family," I suggested. "Maybe it's whether you want to spend your remaining years defined by his betrayal or by your own choices moving forward." Margaret looked at me with surprise, as if the possibility of not being defined by Thomas's actions had never occurred to her. Something shifted in Margaret's expression as she processed my words. "You know, for 37 years, I defined myself as Thomas Chen's widow. I wore that identity like a badge of honor, the woman who'd loved so deeply that she never remarried, never moved on, never stopped grieving." She paused, looking out at the city lights with new clarity. "But I wasn't just grieving Thomas," she continued. "I was grieving the woman I'd been before he died, or before I thought he died. I convinced myself that woman had died with him, that I could never be whole or happy or trusting again. I built my entire identity around loss and loyalty to a man who'd never deserved either." The realization was transformative. Margaret wasn't just discovering that her husband had betrayed her. She was discovering that she'd betrayed herself by allowing his supposed death to define the rest of her life. She'd spent decades in voluntary emotional prison, honoring a man who'd never existed. "David is angry because he thinks Thomas stole our lives," she said, her voice growing stronger. "But the truth is, I gave away most of mine willingly. Thomas stole 7 years of our marriage and David's childhood. I gave away the next 37 years of my own life by choosing to stop living when I thought he died." The distinction was crucial. Margaret was beginning to separate the harm Thomas had caused from the harm she'd caused herself through her choices in response to his betrayal. She couldn't reclaim the years she'd lost to his deception, but she could reclaim the years she'd lost to her own grief and self-limitation. Margaret pulled out her phone and began typing a response to David. I watched her face as she wrote, seeing decades of pain and confusion crystallizing into something resembling resolve. "I'm telling him I won't be going to San Diego," she said. "Not because I'm afraid of confrontation, but because I refuse to spend any more of my life chasing ghosts." Her message was longer than I expected, and she read parts of it aloud as she wrote, "David, I understand your anger, and you have every right to seek whatever justice or closure you need. But I've realized that I don't need to see Thomas's grave or meet his other family to know who I am. I'm not Thomas Chen's widow anymore. I'm not even Thomas Chen's abandoned wife. I'm Margaret Chen, and I have years left to figure out who that woman can be." The transformation was remarkable. The broken, confused woman who'd gotten into my car hours earlier was becoming someone I barely recognized. Not because she'd changed completely, but because she was remembering who she'd been before trauma had convinced her to become smaller and sadder and more limited. "I think I want to travel," she said suddenly, surprising both of us. "I've never been anywhere except to visit David and to work. Thomas and I used to talk about seeing Europe, but then he died, and I convinced myself that dreams died with him. But they were my dreams too, weren't they?" The question was rhetorical, but profound. Margaret was beginning to separate her own desires and possibilities from the shared life she'd thought she'd lost. She was discovering that she didn't need Thomas's presence or even his memory to pursue the things that had once brought her joy. As I finally pulled up to Margaret's apartment building, she made no immediate move to get out of the car. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing the emotional journey we'd shared over the past several hours. The woman sitting behind me was fundamentally different from the one who'd gotten in, not because she'd learned new information about her husband, but because she'd remembered something important about herself. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for the ride, but for listening, for asking the right questions, for helping me see that I don't have to carry Thomas's choices as my burden anymore." She gathered her purse and the envelope of documents, but her movements were purposeful now, rather than defeated. "What will you tell David?" I asked, genuinely curious about how she'd help her son process his own anger and need for justice. Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all evening. "I'll tell him that he gets to choose how to handle his relationship with his father's memory and his father's crimes. But I also hope I can show him that we don't have to let Thomas's betrayal become the defining story of our lives. We survived his abandonment. We built good lives despite his absence. That's not nothing. That's everything." She stepped out of the car and leaned down to the window. "I hope you find peace with your own father's memory," she said. "And I hope you remember that the people we love don't just live on in our grief. They live on in our capacity to keep loving, keep trusting, keep choosing hope over fear." As she walked toward her building, I realized that Margaret Chen had just taught me more about resilience and forgiveness than I'd learned in years of my own struggle with loss. If this story moved you, or if you're dealing with your own questions about forgiveness and moving forward after betrayal, please share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more real stories about the unexpected connections that can change our lives in the span of a single conversation.